and the path to prosperity is maybe engaging in diplomacy.
We signed the exchange of prisoners, but he didn't do it. What kind of diplomacy, JD, you are speaking about?
You and I, taxpayers, will now have to pay for the defense of the claims that Elon is creating. It's not his own money.
Hello, everyone. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. Tonight on America Decides, off the rails. That's where the relationship between Ukraine and the United States at this hour stands. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy clashed with President Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance in the Oval Office for all the world to see. Because this is so important, it may have long-running ramifications for the United States, for Ukraine, for Russia, and possibly all of Europe. We want to share with you an extended exchange of what happened. Please listen.
Do you think that it's respectful to come to the Oval Office of the United States of America and attack the administration that is trying to prevent the destruction of your country?
A lot of questions. Let's start from the beginning.
Sure.
First of all, during the war, everybody has problems. Even you, but you have nice ocean and don't feel now, but you will feel it in the future. God bless.
You don't know that.
God bless. God bless. You will not have a war.
Don't tell us what we're going to feel. We're trying to solve a problem. Don't tell us what we're going to feel.
I'm not telling you.
Because you're in no position to dictate that.
That's
Remember
exactly
this. You're in no position to dictate what we're going to feel. We're going to feel very good.
You will feel influence.
We're going to feel very good and very strong.
You will feel influence.
You're right now not in a very good position. You've allowed yourself to be in a very bad position, and he happens to be right about it.
From the very beginning of the war.
You're not in a good position. You don't have the cards right now. With us, you start having cards. But right now, you don't. Yeah, you're playing cards. You're playing cards. You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III.
President Trump took to social media shortly thereafter, saying in part, quote, he, meaning Zelenskyy, disrespected the United States of America and its cherished Oval Office. He can come back when he is ready for peace. Minutes later, a scheduled joint press conference was canceled, and Zelenskyy left the White House. The two countries were scheduled to sign an agreement today that would give the United States a portion of the profits and long-running access to mining Ukraine's rare earth minerals. This in exchange for continued support in Ukraine's effort against the aggressor power, Russia. That agreement was never signed. Its future remains very much in doubt. I want to start tonight with Ed O'Keefe on the North Lawn of the White House. Ed, what have we learned, if anything, in the hours after Zelenskyy left about how bitter this relationship now stands?
The White House, Major, is now uncertain whether they can get Ukraine and Russia to stop fighting, and there are conversations underway, according to CBS's Jennifer Jacobs, in conversation with some high-level Trump administration officials in the last hour or so, about whether or not the United States should or will pause aid to Ukraine and whether they can continue working with Zelenskyy. It was an incredibly contentious, chaotic, dramatic exchange there in the Oval Office that more than anything seemed to be set off in part by the vice president interjecting and suggesting that Zelenskyy hasn't been grateful and campaigned, in essence, during last year's campaign season by visiting a Pennsylvania-based munitions factory, in essence campaigning for the Biden administration, and more than anything, just not being grateful. Vance himself, of course, a big skeptic and critic of this war, part of the reason Trump picked him as his running mate. The president then, of course, interjecting and telling Zelenskyy he's in trouble, that he needs the United States, that he shouldn't be lecturing them in the Oval Office. And at one point, reporters in the room overheard White House staffers saying to each other, quote, this is going to be big, and that they understood that this clash, that the world was watching, literally. We had dozens of especially European reporters here today in just sheer shock over what was going on in the Oval Office. You know, fighting with each other in such a way that Zelenskyy was then pushed out. We're told he then was moved to the Roosevelt room, as often happens when world leaders come. They go to a separate room in between their meetings. The Trump team determined that the Ukrainian leader had been disrespectful and that there was no way forward today. And they were shocked, frankly, that he wasn't going to sign this minerals agreement. In fact, the American officials thought they'd have more issues with Putin and the Russians ultimately not with Zelenskyy and his team, but because Zelenskyy was seeking those security guarantees, he appeared unwilling to sign this. And so at some point, the Secretary of State and the White House National Security Advisor, Michael Waltz, were sent into the Roosevelt room, and Zelenskyy was trying to say, hey, let's just talk again. Let's reset, let's try to get to a deal. And in essence, Waltz and Rubio told him, you've done yourself no favors today and you can leave. And as the president conveyed over social media, Rubio similarly said, you can come back when you're ready for peace. And so he drove out of here, having canceled a news conference, canceled another public event this afternoon here in Washington. And we're waiting to see how much longer he's here in the United States as the president prepares to spend the weekend in Florida.
And as we've gathered it, part of the backdrop for this is administration frustration, however valid or invalid, but it exists, and it was evident in the clash that the administration believes that Zelenskyy, unwilling to sign a ceasefire without those security guarantees, is being the obstructionist in this. Is that correct?
Yeah, and look, he had a frosty or at times contentious relationship with President Biden as well, right? We know that he would be aggravated with the Ukrainian leader at times, in part because Zelenskyy knows he has no real security skin in the game, right? They gave up their nuclear weapons back in 1994. They don't have NATO membership. They don't have NATO in Ukraine helping them out. They don't have the United States doing it for that matter. Everyone's sending them things, but nobody is really backing them up otherwise. And so his view has always been, unless you're giving me some kind of guarantee, unless you're joining the fight, I've got to be skeptical of these kinds of agreements, and as he was today. The other thing that may have happened here, and some have observed this, and I think it's a correct one, Zelenskyy normally comes with a translator, and there was one there in the room, but opted to spend his time speaking in English, which is not his first language, obviously. And there's a chance that some of this may have been lost in translation today, or his ability to convey what it was he was trying to say may have been lost, given that he was leaning on English instead of Ukrainian. And the scenes we've seen from in that room, the Ukrainian ambassador with her head in her hand, the Secretary of State sitting stone-faced, concerned about this, and apparently tonight multiple European officials calling top Trump officials, asking to what extent the mineral deal can be salvaged and U.S. commitment to Ukraine can be salvaged. And we'll have to wait and see.
So much up in the air. Ed O'Keefe at the White House for us. Thank you so much. Editor-in-Chief of Foreign Policy, Ravi Agrawal, a friend of this show, joins me now. Ravi, it's good to see you. How consequential was this moment today?
It was consequential. This is not the meeting that Volodymyr Zelenskyy wanted. It would have been embarrassing for him, embarrassing for Ukrainians to be treated in this way, but also embarrassing for the United States, I think, to have this form of, ill decorum. I mean, diplomacy is meant to be diplomatic. Diplomacy is often conducted behind the scenes. This should not have been on TV. This should not have been seen by billions of people. And in many parts, maybe this turned out the way it did in part because the cameras were rolling and neither side felt like they could back down. You've played clips of it and you've already seen that everyone's voices are raised and they're escalating on top of each other, almost playing to the gallery because they don't want to be seen as weak by either set of audiences in Ukraine or in the United States. But all in all, this does no one in those two countries any good unless you're Vladimir Putin in Russia.
To that point, Ravi, in his social media post immediately after this dust-up, and it was much more than that, dust-up doesn't begin to describe it, the President of the United States said Ukraine, working with the United States, would have an advantage in negotiations. I don't want advantage. That's the words of the President of the United States. I want peace. And then, very shortly after that, very significant figures within the Russian government began applauding this quote-unquote smackdown of Zelenskyy. Put those things together for us.
It's not good. If you are Russian or have Russia's best interests in mind, the idea of Trump and Zelenskyy meeting is not a great thing. Because, if they have a frank and honest conversation with the right set of advisors, they're going to talk about Russia being the aggressor in this war. They're going to talk about what needs to be done to stop it. And the realistic sort of honest truth to it is that the United States does need to help to backstop any peace deal, any ceasefire that is arrived at, and to secure whatever is left agreed upon as Ukraine's territory. So Russia doesn't want this meeting to happen. So the fact that it blows up the way we've seen it blow up is obviously good news for them, but not for anyone else, not for the international order, not for Europeans, not for what America stands for globally. This was disrespectful to all sides, and certainly not for Ukraine. Ed O'Keefe there was talking about how Zelenskyy is not a native English speaker, and some of what he said may have been lost in translation. I also feel that, this is 3 years into a war. He is someone who is war weary and, at some level also maybe wasn't ready to play the game in this moment of flattery, the flattery that we've seen other world leaders come, the performative TV aspect playing out in front of the cameras. That didn't happen today.
What do you think Zelensky's options are going forward?
He's going to go home first. He's going to sit down with his advisors, try and assess the extent of damage from this. Look, everything he said and did, it may also be popular in Ukraine. No country wants to see their leader appear to be weak. So the fact that, he said what he said about Putin is something that every Ukrainian knows in their bones, and they will respect him for having said the truth there. They will feel angry at the United States. They will feel scared. So he's going to have to weigh his options. His best options are, of course, in Europe, where over the last few weeks, most leaders have rallied to Ukraine's support, and they're very clear in saying that they need to reorient their investments towards defense to make sure that they support Ukraine, but also that Putin can't go further than Ukraine in the future. But then lastly, Ukraine and the United States, what happens next? If you look at today as pure theatricality, a reality TV presidency playing out on our screens, then there could be twists and turns to come which could surprise us. Maybe they make up. We don't know. But if you look at it purely as something that was substantive, this was a disaster.
Ravi Agrawal, thank you very much, sir.
Pleasure.
Now to an update on Pope Francis. The Vatican today said he was put on a breathing machine after a respiratory crisis. Since being placed on a mechanical ventilation system, the Vatican says the pontiff remains, quote, vigilant and oriented. The 88-year-old Pope's current hospital stay, which began 2 weeks ago, is the longest in more than a decade. We'll keep track of the pontiff's health and bring you updates as they come in. President Trump and Ukrainian President Zelenskyy never signed their mineral deal. Today, that was supposed to happen. We'll dig into that next. You're watching America Decides. Welcome back. Ed O'Keefe mentioned a moment ago that President Trump is getting ready to leave the White House for a weekend in Florida. He's on the South Lawn right now preparing to board Marine One, but also talking to reporters. Depending on how long that takes and how many questions he takes and what he says, we may turn some of that sound around for you to hear the president's retrospective on this very historic day and a very tense meeting with Ukrainian President Zelenskyy in the Oval Office. Part of that Oval Office meeting was to be, if things had gone normally, and they most certainly did not, a prelude to a signing ceremony, where Zelenskyy and President Trump were to sign an agreement that would have granted the United States some degree of access to Ukraine's rare minerals in exchange for continued support and implied security guarantees. Instead, that deal is now completely up in the air, and Zelenskyy has left the White House. Here's how today's meeting ended.
But once we sign that deal, you're in a much better position. But you're not acting at all thankful. And that's not a nice thing. I'll be honest, that's not a nice thing.
Gracelyn Bascaron is the director of the Critical Minerals Security Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Fans of this program, and I know there are many of you, remember she was on the program earlier this week going over the details of this to-be-signed minerals deal. Gracelyn, it's not signed. It's in a state of, I don't know, panicked insecurity. What do you make of today's events?
I was on live TV when it happened. It caught me on surprise, too, to be honest, because, we had gotten to a point where we were actually at a draft agreement. It was in writing. So in a way, today felt like it was a day for formalities and signature, but that's obviously not what we got.
And would that deal have been good for Ukraine, good for the United States, and the beginning of a redefinition of this relationship?
The deal would have been very good for Ukraine for a few reasons, right? I mean, consider that no current mineral assets were included in the deal. So only revenues from future projects would we take revenue from under the deal. What that means in the lead up to the time that those projects are developed is that energy infrastructure, transportation infrastructure would be rebuilt, a lot of which was damaged during the war. We would start to see that geological mapping so that we could eventually develop those assets. And we would see some sort of kind of security in place that comes with economic cooperation. So there are near-term benefits for Ukraine that are being bypassed by not signing.
Is this something that can be repaired from your vantage point or based on what you've heard subsequently to this blow up in the Oval Office?
I don't think it's over. I think both sides need to sit and think about it. I think certainly President Zelenskyy, he demonstrated an understanding, awareness, and acknowledge that without U.S. support, kind of standing in the region next to Russia would be quite difficult. So ultimately, there's going to have to be some sort of agreement to enter that next phase. And I think President Zelenskyy needs to think about what he's willing to compromise to get to that point.
We don't know who's at fault here, but we do know senior officials within the Trump administration are describing Zelenskyy's attitude as intemperate and that they were surprised by his request for more guarantees or getting in the way of signing this agreement. That's the Trump administration's current assessment. Does this leave Zelenskyy with very many options, considering how offended, it appears, the Trump administration feels about what happened today?
It was certainly a very inflamed conversation. I think, look, I mean, to me, it's like he's going to have to come to a near-term decision in terms of what is he willing to forego? We knew he wanted security guarantees. From the initial agreement, which was actually, the Ukraine paying $500 billion through mineral revenue back to the U.S. for what he called, for the aid provided, even if that number was a little bit gray as to how it was reached. And then President Zelenskyy wanted security guarantees. The U.S. ultimately compromised on that $500 billion figure and did not ask for that $500 billion to be repaid. In the latest draft agreement, there were still no security guarantees, but he came to Washington hoping to kind of advance that, but didn't quite get it.
Graceland Baskerman, as always, thank you.
House Republicans passed a budget resolution that sets in motion the largest Medicaid cut in American history. Children will be devastated.
So I know this is a somewhat jarring turn, but we're going to go from rare earth minerals to Medicaid and its future. That was House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries today on the budget resolution House Republicans passed earlier this week. I want to bring in Washington Democratic Congresswoman and chair of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, Susan DelBene. We'll get to Medicaid in a second, Congresswoman, but the Trump administration, through senior officials talking to us, is blaming Zelenskyy and his obstructionist attitude for the blow-up today. What is your perspective?
What we saw from the president, from the vice president, was a disgrace. Here we have Ukraine is an ally. They're fighting for their democracy, for their freedom. And instead of supporting them, we have a president and vice president who are petty and small. And even Ronald Reagan would be horrified by what he saw in the White House today.
What do you think the implications of it are?
Well, I think it puts, it's a very dangerous situation. We should be standing by our allies, and it's just disgraceful and shameful what we saw at the White House.
So Hakeem Jeffries and plenty of other Democrats have identified issues with the House Republican budget resolution, which sends instructions to the Energy and Commerce Committee to look for somewhere in the range of $880 billion in reductions to future Medicaid spending. As you know, Congresswoman, Medicaid spending has been going up and up and up at a faster rate than Social Security and Medicare. There are bipartisan analysts who've looked at that and said there are ways to save within Medicaid that do not necessarily or would not necessarily have to harm beneficiaries directly. Are Democrats open to any of those reforms, or is their political posture going to be you can't touch it at all?
Well, I think a budget is a reflection of your values, and we saw that in the Republican budget. They weren't focused on working families or helping children or seniors or veterans. Their one focus was tax cuts for the wealthiest and the well-connected. And when you look at the cuts that they propose, they're not talking about small changes. They're talking about slashing Medicaid, taking people off of health care. And if we're talking about lowering costs, which this last election was all about, they're doing nothing to, Republicans are doing nothing to lower costs. It hasn't been a priority. This would raise costs for working families. So absolutely, the Republican budget is not a reflection of what the American people want to see, and just so disappointing. And that's why you see so many people speaking loudly. We should be fighting to lower costs and absolutely make sure people have affordable quality health care all across the country.
The DCCC, which you lead, and other Democratic organizations filed a lawsuit against the president's recent executive actions to take over the Federal Elections Commission. What's that about?
Well, the Federal Elections Commission is supposed to be an independent commission, making sure that folks are following the laws so that we have free and fair elections. The president is basically saying he wants to control that. And that has nothing to do with free and fair elections. That has to do with him wanting to be able to say things should be done in a way that he wants. He is not an independent, nonpartisan person to be in charge there. So we think the Federal Elections Commission should be an independent commission. It should be upholding election laws that have been put in place.
What are your concerns, to the degree you have them, Congresswoman, about the efforts so far of the Department of Government Efficiency? And have you heard from constituents, because we've been picking this up in town halls across the country, that alarmed either federal workers or their family members or those who are supported by the salaries of those federal workers simply do not believe Democrats in Congress are sounding enough of an alarm or doing enough to reverse this?
Well, I think you're hearing from folks across the country because the impacts of what's happening with the executive orders from President Trump, but the reckless impact of Elon Musk indiscriminately firing people in the federal government. I mean, we basically see the beginnings of a government shutdown right now between President Trump and Elon Musk. The concerns are felt all across the country because they're threatening our public health, our public safety. We see workers being cut, even bird flu inspectors at a time where this is an important issue. And they don't know what they're doing, where they fire people and they say, oh, maybe we need to bring these people back. This has nothing to do with saving money or efficiency. It's chaos. It's dysfunction, and people are speaking out. I had a town hall recently. We had over 14,000 people on our telephone town hall. Normally a strong showing might be 2,000.
Will Democrats in negotiations, and there must be negotiations to avert a government shutdown midway through March, seek legislative language to reverse efforts undertaken by Elon Musk and the Department of Government Efficiency?
Well, let's be clear. Congress controls the purse. And so what's very important is that we put together what programs should be funded, how money should be spent, and the administration needs to follow that. That's the law. And right now we see Republicans wanting to give Elon Musk more authority to indiscriminately decide where money goes. That won't work. We need Republicans and the administration to follow the law. That's what we're going to focus on. It's very important that we have government working for the people, and we're going to continue to fight for that.
Very quickly, the midterms are a while away, but do you believe Republicans will be running on government of efficiency cuts or Democrats running against them come midterm election time?
I think we're seeing the chaos and dysfunction and the broken promises from Republicans right now. And they're going to be accountable for that in the next election. They are breaking promises by raising costs for working families. They said that was a focus. Clearly, it's not. The chaos, the dysfunction, not standing up for working families. That's going to be what American people are going to be thinking about when they're at the ballot box. And that's why you'll see us taking back the majority in the House of Representatives in 2026.
We shall see. Congresswoman Susan DelBene, thank you very much for your time.
Thank
A clash
you.
between global leaders in our nation's capital, specifically the Oval Office of the White House. Our strategist panel will join us next To discuss that and much more, you're watching America Decides. I want to bring in our chief White House correspondent, Nancy Cordes, alongside our political panel. Chuck Rocha, who, as you might well remember, formerly served as senior advisor on Senator Bernie Sanders' 2016 and 2020 presidential campaigns, and Danielle Alvarez, senior advisor on President Trump's 2024 campaign. It's great to have all of you with us. Nancy, you were just out there on the South Lawn, is that right?
I was, and I asked President Trump what Zelenskyy would need to do to restart talks after things went so disastrously off the rails today. And what President Trump just said, you played it out there, is he's got to say, I want to make peace. He can't stand there and say Putin this, Putin that, all negative things. He has to say, I don't want to fight a war any longer. He doesn't have the cards. President Trump, and again in that Q&A with reporters, said that he wants a ceasefire immediately. He wants to end the war immediately. And he seemed to be suggesting that Zelenskyy is holding out for things that he thinks would drag peace talks out too long, and also that he thinks Zelenskyy doesn't have the leverage to ask for. So basically, he seemed to be suggesting Zelensky's got to take what he can get from me, or I'm not interested in restarting talks.
Danielle Alvarez, your assessment of this day and where relations stand between the U.S. and Ukraine.
Here's what I'll say, and I've been fortunate to be in the room with President Trump, as you know, seeing him being fierce and relentless in negotiations. He's going to do what is best for the American people, and he's going to do what he promised on the campaign trail, and that is bring peace through strength. What you heard him say on the South Lawn was exactly that. What he wants to make sure is that both nations can come to the table, and it's hard to bring both to the table when each is the aggressor of the other. Of course, Russia being the initial aggressor of Ukraine, but Ukraine also has to want to strike a deal, cannot make a deal and have an ally with America and the American people only to bring us to war. We know that the American people don't want that. They don't want to continue to spend billions of taxpayer dollars, not only on an endless war, but on a war between other nations.
Daniel, do you think it matters to President Trump or the White House that immediately after this confrontation with Zelenskyy, prominent members of the Russian government began to applaud the president and call Zelenskyy, among other things, an insolent pig who got slapped down? I mean, to have immediate Kremlin applause for an American president dealing with a situation like that, do you think that lands well with the president or his senior advisors?
I think that the president, again, is focused on what is best for America. He is trying to bring both parties to the table, and both parties have to want to get to peace, have to want to end this war. And what we can't have is President Zelenskyy entering the White House, entering the West Wing, sitting in the Oval Office, trying to use the American media to promote his propaganda and trying to bring America into this fight and bring it into war when, again, the deal is very clear. President Trump will get involved and will deliver peace should both nations want to reach that agreement.
Very quickly, Danielle, what was propagandistic about what Zelenskyy said?
He wanted to rehash everything that has happened, and what we need to do is move forward. President Trump, again, has said that he will not continue to support chaos abroad. He will not continue to support war. And the same way that he was able to strike a deal between Israel and Hamas and a ceasefire, he is very focused on making sure that the same can be accomplished between Russia and Ukraine. He said it on the campaign trail. He has not wavered from his commitment, and that is to stop the loss of lives. And in order to do that, America is going to make sure that everyone can have a seat at the table and is going to make sure that the end result is peace, and President Trump will not waver from that.
Chuck, your thoughts?
Contentious. Contentious is an understatement. Where I come from, anybody gets that loud and that close to you, normally there's some furniture moving around. Let me just say this. The only one who won today was a dictator in Russia. We have to support the folks that are our friends. That's why they're called allies. Do we need to give every bit of dollars that we have to every foreign country? I could not disagree with what's being said on the internet right now. There's a way to be an adult. And if you watch today, if you go back and watch that again, watch J.D. Vance. This thing was almost over. We were going to get something done. And then he was like, no, 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 no. I want to go in and poke the bears and blow this whole thing up. And he did exactly what he wanted to. And then we went on this rampage. Things are really tough when you have folks coming after each other, but there's a way through history to act like a president, act like you're in head of this country, and make sure you're not putting America last. I want to fight the Russians over there. I don't want to fight the Russians right here.
Do you think when President Zelenskyy said the United States might feel threatened by Russia in the future, and President Trump jumped in and said, don't tell us what we're going to feel, that there was something about what Zelenskyy said that bruised President Trump's sense of America First ego?
For sure.
Chuck.
Donald Trump ain't never been in a fight in his whole life. And when you poke at a bully, it makes him upset. And that's exactly what he did, because he said the same thing that a lot of folks have said all around the national security apparatus. Is sure, there's an ocean there. That's why we want to fight the war on the other side of it.
Nancy Cordes, Chuck Rocha, and Danielle Alvarez, thank you very, very much. Coming up, the new report from Wired that says DOGE, that's Department of Government Efficiency, and its attempt to take over and certainly reimagine the federal government is, quote, worse than you think. We'll talk to the reporter who wrote about that next. You're watching America Decides.
Last week, the president encouraged me via Truth Social and also via phone call to be more aggressive. And I was like, okay, I do what the president asks. And I said, can we send out an email to everyone just saying, what did you get done last week? And the president said yes.
Welcome back. That's the very recognizable Elon Musk earlier this week in the cabinet room of the White House at the president's first cabinet meeting. A new report from Wired finds that DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, will be intensifying its efforts to overhaul the federal government. That's putting it mildly. It says this in part, quote, what is happening to the U.S. government right now is bad. What comes next is worse. Brian Barrett joins us now. He's the executive editor of news at Wired. Brian, why that emphatic conclusion? It's already bad and it's going to get worse. How do you reach that conclusion?
Well, I think there's a couple of things going on here. I think first, DOGE, it has so little transparency that it's hard to tell what's really going on. It's hard to get a full picture of what is happening, how many cuts there are from which agencies. So the worst part comes in as you suddenly start to realize the cumulative effect of these cuts. But I think the more important thing is, already DOGE has fired thousands of federal workers. They've canceled thousands of government contracts. They plan to fire many, many, many more. Each of those government workers does something. Each of those federal contracts serves some purpose. So as those people are no longer there doing the thing they are supposed to do, and those contracts are no longer, and programs are no longer serving the needs that they're intended to, you're going to feel the real impacts of this. So right now you've got people being fired, which is bad, but the ripple effects of that, the missing programs, the missing workers, if you've got the Social Security Administration, who's going to be sending out the checks? I think these are real questions that we're going to get the answers to sooner rather than later, and they're going to be hard answers.
And do you think that's going to be evident to Americans 3 or 4 months down the road in the interactions that they have casually with the federal government, either with the IRS, the Social Security Administration, the Forest Service, some other part of it? They're going to ask or send in an email or interact and find either less service or no one answering at all. Is that your assessment?
I think I would just put it in terms of weeks rather than months. I think because these are all things that are happening right now. Just as a small example, the federal government has capped all of the credit cards that are the equivalent of corporate cards that government employees use to travel or to take care of daily expenses. Now they can only charge $1 to that card, so basically they've all been frozen out. So people can't get to places they need to go to do their jobs already. People can't buy the equipment that they need, even people who are still in their roles, to do their jobs. I think we're going to see that on a little level here and there, things already starting to break. And then you worry about the bigger things that are going to break. You worry about a bird flu that is getting worse. And DOGE already accidentally fired a bunch of people who were working to prevent bird flu. I hope they all come back. They're under no obligation to. I'm not sure why they would want to work for this administration. So from little things to big things, I think we're going to see a degradation of services, of programs that are really going to be felt everywhere in America and around the world.
And Brian, Wired has been very aggressive in this particular aspect of reporting on the Department of Government Efficiency, conflict of interest with those assigned by DOGE to get into these agencies. Be as general or as specific as you want about that particular level of reportage at Wired.
I think that issue feels really, speaks to a lot of the bigger issues around the DOGE project, which is what are they really trying to accomplish here? It can't be efficiency, because there's nothing efficient about firing a bunch of people and having no plans to replace them or pick up the slack when they're gone. That's not efficient. That sort of grinds things down even further. When we look at the conflicts of interest that we are talking about, we try to look back for historical precedent for example, Tom Krause, who is currently in a high-ranking position at the Treasury Department, while he's also, his day job, he is the CEO of a cloud computing company. And drawing a salary there and working both places. We tried to look for a precedent for when that would happen. We had to go back to World War I, World War II for any time that someone actually had those dual roles for a consistent amount of time. There are precedents for this, but you have to go back a long way, and frankly, it didn't work out too well that time. I want to be clear, we haven't found any indications of any untoward activity, but just the fact of it, the apparent disregard for how obvious these conflicts of interest are is concerning.
What about data security? There's been tremendous reportage about how much access, write-in, read-in, or scraping could be going on through DOGE in these vast government databases.
And this gets back to the transparency issue. We know that DOGE is demanding access to the Treasury payment system, Department of Education, you name it, wherever they've been, they want this information. We don't know what they're doing with it. We don't know where it's going. There have been some reports that they have fed it into an unnamed AI model to do who knows what. And of course, one thing that we're concerned about is that when you feed something into an AI model, it then becomes training data and gets put into the model and can be used for other things. The US government has more sensitive data about US citizens than anything else, anyone else in the world, by an order of magnitude. And the idea that these people who, as far as we know, have not been through a strict vetting process, and as we do for sure know, sometimes are working in the very industries that are regulated by the agencies that they are in, is again, it sort of boggles the mind that this is being allowed to happen unfettered and that there's no seeming accountability, transparency, or auditing that's going on as part of this.
Brian, I'm going to give you about 45 seconds for this one. Assess how accurate DOGE has been about its receipts of savings.
Not very. I think there's great reporting out there that shows that they've had some high-profile misses. They once said they saved $8 billion a program when it was actually $8 million. They recently had to remove their 5 biggest tallied savings from their DOGE savings tracker because they turned out to be incorrect. They have a number on there that's $65 billion. I don't know how accurate it is based on the inaccuracies they've had before. And more importantly, that's a drop in the bucket compared to the $4 trillion budget that Congress is going to pass.
And Brian, is it your sense that when this is all in the rear view, DOGE will have cost the federal government more money or save the federal government more money?
I think it depends on how you think of it. I think it's important not to lose sight of the opportunity cost. DOGE might save money by firing federal workers, but if we are less prepared to handle a pandemic, if we are less able to prevent people from getting sick or contain a measles outbreak, there are real costs there, both in terms of human life, but also in terms of the money that we will have to spend to take care of things in the back end. There is in the same reason that you want to spend more on preventative measures than you do on sort of fixing the problem afterwards.
Brian Barrett with Wired, thank you very much. That does it for today. I know that was a bit abrupt, but sometimes it happens. We'll be back. That means I will be back with another edition of America Decides Monday at 5 p.m. Eastern. I hope to see you then. The Daily Report starts right now.